I'm now going to pass over to Angela Voss, who's going to begin to unpack some of this, I think, in the Western esoteric traditions in particular. But Angela, let me hand over to you.
Thank you. Okay, I hope everyone can hear me. I'm just going to share my screen so I can get onto my PowerPoint. There we go. So I hope everyone can see that okay. It's absolutely amazing to be here, and I think this is going to be a very exciting day. And thank you for that really inspiring introduction, Mark. It's really well excited me about what we're going to explore. I haven't got very long, and there's quite a lot I'd like to say, so I'll just sort of plunge straight in, really. I guess I've been trying to bring spiritual intelligence into education for many years now, and I want to talk to you a little bit about what I've been doing, what we've been doing, what have been our ideals in trying to create this quite challenging marriage between spiritual intelligence and the restraints of the academic world. First of all, I just wanted to say what a beautiful illustration this is that Mark has chosen to illuminate this conference, 15th century illustration by Giovanni di Paolo. And I was just kind of musing on the fact that the erotic kind of combination of this, the erotic marriage, I guess, between Dante and Beatrice as they move towards the sun is just such a perfect metaphor for what we're trying to do, that we're connecting with eros, we're connecting with a kind of meeting of the soul which is yearning for something more, something deeply ineffable, of which we occasionally get glimpses of some kind of unity. And for me, this is what transformative education has always been about. And today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what the tropological turn means, which will be explored a bit later by some of our other speakers. But it's a crucial idea in providing a kind of model of how it's possible to transform through study. So here's a picture of Canterbury Cathedral from my office at Canterbury Christ Church University, which I think is extremely symbolic. And I was told some years ago in a dream that it was very important for me to keep to the mainstream in this work, which I have done for many years now, since early 2000s. I was reading a review that I wrote many years ago, back in 1990, of something published by Element Books, and I was very struck by the fact that Element Books said there is a rapidly developing world movement towards spiritual harmony, understanding and growth. Back in 1990, where is this rapidly developing world towards spiritual harmony, particularly in the world of education? I can't say that I've really seen it around me in the educational projects we have been involved in. But I kind of feel it's now happening outside the universities. We made a valiant effort for it to happen within the universities, and I think we achieved a huge amount. But there's a conflict, which maybe will come up later in the day, you know, about how the spiritual intelligence that Mark was talking about can actually be contained within the bureaucratic structures of the university. I'll just say something briefly about the history of transformative learning as a kind of movement, because it does have, you know, quite significant educational precedents in sort of two ways. That there's a kind of, the original transformative learning movement was instigated by someone called Paulo Freire in the 20th century, and it was very much a social movement concerned with pedagogical improvement, particularly for oppressed communities. And that's quite different from a second movement that has grown up much more in the wake of Jung and transpersonal philosophy, represented by writers such as John Dirks, Rosemary Anderson, and William Browd, Cheryl Hunt, Elizabeth Tisdale, Wilma Fraser, Marie Angelo, and many, many others who are concerned with a pedagogy of the imaginal and a pedagogy of the soul, particularly to do with restoring the soul to adult learning and postgraduate learning. Obviously, there's a lot of educational movements too concerned with younger age groups. And they come much more from a Jungian or transpersonal perspective and have brought into the academic arena methods based on intuitive, heuristic, autobiographical, somatic, reflexive, deeply personal reflective methods too. And often these are now informed by spiritual and esoteric philosophy. But I was always quite amazed in the education department at Christ Church how little these ideas seem to be taken up by anybody around us or outside the programs that we were actually developing. Also, of course, learning as a practice, that there's a sort of hermeneutics of creativity, of being involved in creative arts, narrative, creative writing, and particularly divinatory practice, which has been central to what we have been doing and has really is a method of learning and knowing that has been relegated to the whole realm of New Age woo-woo superstition, you know, no longer having a valid place in a Western academic model. And we've been very, very keen to bring that back, the whole process of what it means to know through a divinatory inquiry, which Jeffrey will be talking about a little bit later. And of course, all this goes against the grain of the enlightened humanist scholar who advocates a kind of agnostic empiricism where the researcher or the student is mentally detached in a way from exactly what they're studying, and that the personal, the deeply spiritual, the deeply sense of the sacredness of study doesn't become part of the object of which they're studying. So there's been quite a gap there. There's been a bridge that we've needed to build or tried to build. And of course, soul work then resists the dominant ideologies of modernity as arbiters of truth, which are materialism, scientific empiricism, and perhaps evolutionary biology, and owes much to Plato, owes much to the Platonic and Neoplatonic traditions. And we always find ourselves going back to Plato's cave as a metaphor for awakening, and remembering that the word education has two roots in Latin, you know, educare and educere, and the educare having much more of a sense of training and moulding, which is how it seems to be more today, whereas educare has the sense of leading out from somewhere, such as leading out from the shadows of those trapped in Plato's cave, you know, just looking at the back walls and only seeing the shadows and taking them from reality. And that somehow education is about turning around and coming out of that cave and seeing things differently and more clearly and more truthfully. As John Carey said, you know, if what we learn does not change us, then we have not really learned anything at all. So that's really the premise of a transformative learning, that it means taking the courage and having the risk of moving away from the norm and turning around and seeing that there may be something outside what we're told of is reality, consists of reality.
In your book, Re-enchanting the Academy, which arose from a conference we held in
I'm sorry about that. There seems to be a...
Simon Wilson and I gathered together 16 educators and researchers.
There seems to be somebody me talking over this slide. Maybe if I just move on, that will disappear. Okay. So yes, we're talking about reinstating the imaginal realm. And Peter Abbs, who was an educationalist and poet, said, why have we developed a notion of knowledge and therefore of education which excludes passion, fantasy, intuition, feeling, hunch and apprehension, doubt, belief, impression, dream, vision, and the symbolic forms through which these powers or states of being can be explored or elaborated? given form, structure, and coherence. The transformation is not to be found in rational arguments. The truth of transformation is to be found in of the power of metaphor and narrative, and the way we create these narratives to make meaning of our world. So the Socratic motto of know thyself is really absolutely central to this, through revealing dimensions of knowing that take us far deeper than literal thinking, and requiring an imaginative exploration of our inner worlds, which connect back to our heart and therefore connect to ethical action. And this kind of exploration may even lead to a kind of spiritual revelation as our learning connects with our deepest desires. And it's so interesting that the word desidere, desire, actually means looking at the stars, or coming from the stars, or longing for the stars. And Plato says, you know, the very beginnings of philosophy start with the awe that's inspired in the heart, when you just simply go outside and look up at the stars, and that instills a longing to know about oneself and the world, and to ultimately return back to those stars. And this is what the love of wisdom is, Philosophia. And of course, she's a goddess. She's the principle of feminine wisdom. And we're talking about the marriage of heaven and heart. We're talking about the marriage of Venus and Mercury, if you like, who give birth to Eros, give birth to Cupid. And this is what is a metaphor, I guess, for what will arise in the hearts of people who undergo a kind of transformative learning experience, where they're balancing the rational mind with imaginative vision and intuitive vision. Something new will arise, something which is very powerfully erotic and connective and unitive and mysterious. And I think it is connected with the desire of the soul to return to its home. So Paul Tillich, the theologian, said that all arts create symbols for a level of reality and ourselves which cannot be reached in any other way. And I just wanted to find an example, really, of a kind of symbolic image which powerfully states this kind of inner sense of unity that we have when we form the world into symbol. And this is from Robert Flood's The Mirror, the Whole of Nature and the Image of Art, which is an extraordinary symbol which encapsulates, you know, the whole of the cosmos, as well as the whole of the world, and shows how art is connected to the highest intelligence of God, and then sort of connects it back down to the earth, the ape being like the kind of the human attempt to sort of ape, to copy copy nature, through whom one is then reaching out to God. So there's this sort of threefold process through which divine energy comes through the world, through the angelic realm, through the cosmos, through the elements, through the human arts and crafts, right through into our world. And a diagram like this is not literally true, it's not astronomically true, but it shows that we have an internal image in our souls of a kind of unity which forms itself in these spheres around us, and in which somehow we kind of unpick or unveil as we try and get through to the core of ourselves. And this kind of symbolic image is intensely powerful. It's not meant to be true in a scientific sense, but its truth is inner and its truth is deeply spiritual. And it shows that we are playing a part in something far greater than we are on our humble little earth. We reduce everything to the literal, we reduce everything to the rational and empirical explanation, which denies the power of the symbolic meaning to open an inner journey. And I just love this particular image that somebody found in mould behind their fridge. You know, do you just dismiss it as mould, or would you take this up as actually something more significant? Now, I want to move to the sort of core of what I wanted to say today, really, which is about a method of accessing this spiritual intelligence or this other dimension through a sort of process of a fourfold movement of the soul. And we've used this in a method, as a kind of methodology for students to study sacred texts, images. And I particularly love the Neoplatonic way that it's represented in terms of statue magic. So the ancient Neoplatonic and Hermetic theurgic and magical rituals, a key part of them was the idea that you could animate a statue. You could actually bring the literal stone of a statue alive through your mode of perceiving it. And Proclus, one of the last great Neoplatonists, talks about the fact that this is a process of apprehension and perception. This isn't a process of a kind of literal black and white objective thing happening out there in the world. And this is, I think, something that is so important to remember, that we're talking about a change of perception, a change of attitude, a change of the way we apprehend things, the way we think about knowledge. And so he says that when one goes through this process of animating statues, or the god of the statue becoming alive, yes, they're first seen as a sense object of stone or wood, whatever they're made of. But then the viewer is led to see them as actually a representation of the deity. But then one moves to a place where they're not just a representation, but they actually reflect the divine nature. And that's a subtle difference, which we'll come to. And then the fourth stage, which would be where the viewer actually feels participating with the nature of the deity, or even identifying with the nature of the deity. And at that point, the very statue itself seems to live and move and give oracles and speak. So there's been a kind of this movement through of deepening perception from this literal sense object right through to the awakening. You could say the awakening is the soul of the world, really, within the object, within the statue, within the talismanic image. And this process through is something that we no longer do with art. We no longer do with our images, with our texts. We tend to stop at the level of representation. And the idea of moving through the levels was also present within the Christian tradition and the Judaic tradition, that when reading sacred scripture, one could read it literally, one could read it allegorically as standing for something else, one could read it in a moral sense, i.e. that it actually had an impact upon you and the way you act and thought. And then you could finally read it in a mystical sense, where it could take you to great heights of spiritual understanding. But one had to actually move through these different modes to get there. To stay at the literal would mean just kind of, I think Augustine said, it would just be like the deadness of the letter. You know, nothing would live, nothing would come alive from the text. Dante was the first to apply these theological levels to poetry, thus establishing the genre of what he called poetic theology. And from here we come to the Renaissance, where the idea of moving through these different levels also became applied to art itself. So art and poetry becoming vehicles for divine revelation, not just scripture, you know, through deliberate use of the symbolic and the metaphoric language, because this is what creates the movement, is the power of art, art's language of symbol and metaphor, to shift you away from one meaning only, which is the literal. So in this diagram here, I want to try and show how we might give some kind of structure or framework to this process, that one starts off with a kind of literal reading, which is the object one's reading about at face value, it's its historical meaning, it's a rational explanation, it's maybe the embodiment of it. It's something on the surface. We all know what it means to take something literally. This is a literal approach to the world, as Mark was talking about earlier. And then if we move to an allegorical understanding, we're moving to a place where we understand this thing as being represented by something else, or speaking other of the same thing. So, as also says, art becomes allegorized as love, for example. But if you take the literal and the process, it's still something where you're standing outside and you're saying this thing by this other thing, and that expands its meaning. It kind of gives all sorts of mythological and cultural associations, but it doesn't necessarily. This is really where most education is. It's where most art history is, most music history is. It's where it's as far as we tend to go. But if you take this, the fourfold method as the religious traditions understood it, then the third sense that one moves to is the tropological or moral sense, where there's a major shift in the way you start understanding what you're studying as not just something outside you, but something that has deep meaning for you and something that's at stake for you. And this is called tropological because it's about the turning of your soul inwards to understand something on a much deeper level. So it's where the reader or viewer is personally moved or impelled to change or act. And it involves a kind of presencing of the material to you, a sort of tasting of it, a real internalizing of it, a real understanding of it that is not just conceptual or intellectual as the allegorical might be. And once one's reached that stage, you know, it can be expressed in so many different ways, through poetry, through narrative, through contemplative means, through poetic means, through symbol, through metaphor. This is what Jung's idea of synchronicity, you know, would activate this level. And from there, it seems that sometimes this quite mysterious insight can open out, which is called the anagogic or the mystical insight, some kind of sense of unity or spiritual meaning connecting back to one's deep inner sense. Of course, there's a movement back, really backwards and forwards between these two, and a movement back to the literal as well. You know, you don't move away from the world, you don't move into some transcendent space. This is actually a kind of connected experience where once one's gained some kind of deeper insight, which perhaps lift the personal to more of a universal meaning, one's also embracing its fully embodied and literal meaning. So this is a kind of holistic model which can lead you from a mental understanding through to an imaginative understanding, through a very deeply personal understanding, right through to a mystical understanding if one follows it through. And of course action is involved too, that once one's taken the implications of the text or what you're studying to heart, then often you have to change the way you act in the world and think in the world. So it's a really pivotal point of understanding here. And the kind of knowledge that we're talking about here, when we're talking about moving to a mystical level, is the knowledge of gnosis. It's the knowledge of that brings in what we call the divine, or deep intuitive sense of connection with the ground of being. So this is the return to perhaps a glimpse of something very, very deep indeed. But we don't often go there. We tend to stay at the literal and the allegorical. So yes, symbol, desire, enchantment, imagination, participation and reflexivity back to ourselves are all methods of moving to the tropological sense. Just an example of it by James Hillman, where we can see it looked through the heart. So we have a physical heart, the literal heart, allegorized as love, having much more of a sense of the moral heart when enacted by somebody like the lion heart, and then becoming a spiritual or sacred heart when seen through the lens of Christianity. And Geoffrey will be talking more later about how this fourfold unfolds through the act of divination, where through an image or a particular method, ritual method of allegory, something can be opened up for the client which provokes a realization of a participation in something far greater. But I will leave that to Geoffrey. And of course, what unlocks this topological sense is the active imagination. It's actually allowing the imagination to take free rein and interpret something in a way that allows it to speak to you very deeply and personally. And we're not used to doing this. We're used to the imagination being something, some extra, something that's added on to education. It's not central to knowing. And in traditions such as the Neoplatonic tradition, it is the imagination which forms the bridge between the sense perception and the spiritual knowing. And engaging the active imagination then allows the tropological turn to start happening and for you to start moving. We'll be hearing from Jeff Kripal later, but I absolutely love what he writes about this. And he says, when the imagination looks at the surface, it is a spinner of fantasies. When it looks through, it becomes a window of revealed truths from some deeper part of the soul or the world. And the imagination is the mode of knowing that intuits the unknowable and turns it into the knowable, so that we can have some sense of something which otherwise we would have no image of or no way of grasping. So the imagination is what allows the spiritual to come down and be transformed into something in our world, like a text or an image. So there's a kind of two-way process there, and our imagination is the bridge. He talks about UFOs as being these kind of objects that can be transformed between worlds in a way that they are both structurally observable and have some kind of literal sense, but they also come from some completely unknowable place. And this is the great mystery we're talking about, really, that there's a possibility of crossing between worlds. And he says such symbols are relays, as it were, from something invisible and structurally unknowable to our own local forms of cultural consciousness. That is to say, to the extent that it permits at least some kind of communication across radically different metaphysical orders, the symbolic function renders the impossible possible. I think that's what I really want to stress, is that the symbolic function allows in something that, by looking at the world literally, you will never ever get a glimpse of. And opening up the symbolic and opening up the metaphoric is the kind of transformative aspect of learning that we've been involved with for many years, and which I feel desperately now needs to be restored into all our ways of knowing as primary, not as a secondary add-on to our rational minds. And I've just ended with some ecological implications of this, which I won't necessarily read out because you will get the PowerPoint. But to restore these ways of knowing and to restore the topological sense, which can lead to a spiritual sense, in my view, is deeply, deeply ecological and has implications for the sustainability of our planet in terms of revisioning how we view the whole world. So I think that is my time up. So I will end there.
Thank you very much, Angela. Thank you for beginning to unpack and show us that this is a way, and this is something that can be learned, it can be followed. And I'm going to hand over very speedily now to David Lorimer, to continue to develop these basic themes for us.